The house always smelled like lemons on Thursdays. Emily scrubbed the counters raw that morning, her hands raw from bleach and restless energy. She'd inherited the habit from their mother, who believed chaos could be sanitized into submission, but no amount of polishing could erase the fingerprints Jake left on her life. He arrived at 3:17 p.m. She checked the clock above the stove, its hands trembling like her pulse. Through the peephole, he looked smaller than she remembered, shoulders hunched under a leather jacket 2 sizes too worn. His knuckles hovered mid-air, poised to knock again, but she swung the door open before he could. The draft carried the scent of gasoline and cheap cigarettes, a smell that clung to him like bad luck. He said, grinning too wide, too soon. The duffel bag on his shoulder sagged, its zipper split like a wound. She didn't step aside. "What's burning this time?" The grin faltered. "It's not like that. This is solid. A buddy's got a raid upstate, crypto mining. You put in 15 grand, you triple it in 6 weeks. It's algorithms, math." She turned toward the kitchen, her socked feet silent on the tiles. The kettle screamed on the stove, a sound she'd grown to hate. Jake followed, his boots tracking mud she'd mopped that morning. "I'm good for it," he said, leaning against the fridge. A magnet from their childhood cabin clattered to the floor. He didn't pick it up. "Swear on Mom's grave." Her fingers tightened around the kettle. Their mother's grave was a half-rotten wooden cross in a field nobody visited. Jake had missed the funeral. Too busy, he'd said, though the bruises on his jaw that day suggested otherwise. 2 weeks ago, it was 10 grand for an app, she said, pouring boiling water into mugs she'd bought at a yard sale. Chipped, like everything else. "Where's the app, Jake? Where's anything?" He palmed the back of his neck, a tic he'd had since he was 12. "Look, the developer ghosted, okay? But this is different. I've got skin in the game. You think I'd come here if I didn't?" Yes, she thought. The clock ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked at nothing. She slid his coffee across the counter. Black, no sugar. He'd stopped taking cream after their parents died, as if denying himself sweetness might make him harder. It hadn't. He gulped it, wincing at the heat. "I just need a leg up. One chance. You're the only one who ever." His voice frayed. The silence thickened. Emily studied the cracks in the ceiling, hairline fractures from last winter's storms. Mark had promised to fix them. Mark promised a lot of things. Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then shoved it deep into his pocket. Too deep. "Who's asking?" she said quietly. "Nobody." "Who, Jake?" His jaw worked. "Some guys. They're just impatient." The admission hung between them sour. She pictured him in some backroom, cards slick in his hands, the kind of men who collected debts with fists, not lawyers. Their father had known men like that. She opened the jump drawer, rummaging past dead batteries and take-out menus. The envelope was where she'd hidden it. Under a stack of coupons expired last summer. 5,000, half her secret stash, the money Mark thought was for a new HVAC. Jake's eyes lit up. I don't. She thrust the cash at him. "This is it. No more chances." He grabbed it, thumbing through the bills like a hymn. "You won't regret this. I'll pay you back double. Triple." She almost believed him. Almost. He left the way he always did, in a rush, the screen door slamming behind him. Through the window she watched him jog to a pickup parked crookedly by the curb. A man sat in the passenger seat, face shadowed by a baseball cap. The engine roared, tires spitting gravel. The clock read 3:44 p.m. In the garage, Emily dragged a box from the top shelf. Dust rained down, settling in her lungs. Inside lay photo albums, their spines cracked with age. A younger Jake grinned up at her. 8 years old, missing a front tooth, holding a blue ribbon from the county science fair. First place. Solar-powered model car. He'd soldered the circuits himself. She snapped the album shut. Potential was a knife. By dusk, the rain started. She stood at the sink, scrubbing the mugs again. Headlights swept the driveway. Mark's Audi, precise as a scalpel. He'd be hungry. He'd ask about the HVAC fund. She dried her hands, the lemon scent long gone. Mark's keys hit the porcelain bowl by the door with the violence that made Emily flinch. She kept her back to him, scrubbing a non-existent stain on the stove. The kitchen smelled of burnt garlic and lemon polish, a clash of neglect and desperation. He didn't speak, she didn't turn. The silence between them had calcified over months, sharp as the icicles clinging to the gutters outside. She tracked his movements by sound, the clink of ice in a glass, the rustle of paperwork, the sigh he reserved for broken things. When his shadow finally fell across the stove, she saw his reflection in the greasy hood vent. Tie askew, jaw tight, eyes avoiding hers. "Roofers called," he said. "They can start next week. I'll need the HVAC fund." Her sponge froze mid-circle. The envelope under the coupons was empty now, the money handed to Jake in a parking lot 2 days prior. She'd told herself it was the last time. She'd lied. "We should wait," she said. "Spring storms might—" Wait, the word cracked like old wood. The ceiling in the attic's already sagging. "You wanted to collapse on us." "On you," she thought. "You'd notice then." She turned, drying her hands on a towel embroidered with "Home Sweet Home," a wedding gift from his mother, who'd never liked her. He was already walking away, his dress shoes clipping the hardwood like a metronome counting down to disaster. That night, rain seeped through the cracks he promised to fix. Emily lay awake, listening to the drip-drip into the bucket they'd placed in the hall. Mark slept turned away, his breath steady and indifferent. She imagined the water rising, dissolving the floors, the walls, the life they built into something unrecognizable. At dawn, she found him at the kitchen table, spreadsheets glowing on his laptop. He didn't look up. "I'll handle the roof," she said. His fingers paused over the keys. "With what?" She opened her mouth, but the lie curdled. The HVAC fund was gone. The savings account was a joke. Even the change jars she'd kept since college sat hollow, rated for Jake's last emergency. Mark closed the laptop with a snap. "You gave it to him again." It wasn't a question. Wind rattled the windows. Somewhere, a branch snapped. She drove to the bank that afternoon, past the bakery where Jake had worked briefly last fall. The help wanted sign was still up, faded by sun and resignation. The teller handed her a stack of crisp hundreds. Their joint account led to cover Mark's silence. At home, she found the attic ladder unfolded. Mark stood amid insulation and dust, a flashlight clenched in his teeth. He pried up a rotting board, exposing the skeletal rafters. "Termites," he said, spitting the word along with the flashlight. "Whole beams compromised." She stared at the hollowed wood, at the fragile web of tunnels. A single poke would crumble it. "We'll fix it," she said. He laughed. A bitter, unfamiliar sound. "With what, Emily? Magic?" The beam groaned overhead. By week's end, the money was gone. 8,000 to the roofers, 2,000 to the exterminator, the rest swallowed by the dark maw of unforeseen expenses. Mark stopped eating dinner at home, stopped leaving his keys in the bowl, stopped pretending. Emily began stealing cash from her own paycheck, stuffing it into a coffee can buried in the freezer. For the next crisis. For the next time Jake's voice would crack over the phone. Please. I'm clean now, I swear." One evening, she found Mark's suitcase open on the bed. Not packed, just there, like a threat. "Business trip," he said when she froze in the doorway. "You don't travel for work." He zipped the suitcase slowly, teeth bared in something that wasn't a smile. Things change. The rain returned. The bucket overflowed. Emily woke to the crash of plaster. A chunk of ceiling in the hall, water pooling like a confession. She mopped in circles, the lemon scent mixing with mildew. When her phone buzzed, Jake's name, a string of pleading texts, she hurled it into the wall. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of light. Mark found her crouched in the debris, shards glittering in her hair. "You're losing it," he said, not unkindly. She pressed a sliver of glass to her palm. "This is real," she thought. "This, you can't ignore." But he was already walking away, the suitcase thumping down the stairs. The nausea arrived like a thief, quiet, persistent, stealing the color from her mornings. Emily blamed the stress, the damp creeping through the walls, the takeout she'd been eating since Mark stopped coming home for dinner. She scrubbed the bathroom tiles raw, the lemon cleaner masking nothing. Her reflection in the mirror wavered, pale as the steam curling off the shower. At work, the world tilted. A client's voice blurred into static, her keyboard swam under her fingers. Colleen from accounting caught her sagging against the copier. "You look like death," she said, half joking. Emily forced a laugh. but the room kept spinning. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and recycled hope. A nurse pricked her arm, clucked at her vitals. Dehydration, she said, handing Emily a paper cup of water. But the doctor's eyes narrowed at the chart. When was your last period? The question hung, absurd. Mark hadn't touched her in months. But the dates lined up. A night in December, whiskey on his breath, his hands rough with want. She'd stared at the ceiling, counting cracks until he rolled away. The ultrasound gel was cold. The screen flickered to life, a grainy pulse. There, the doctor said, circling a shadow with her pen. Strong heartbeat. Emily's throat closed. She'd buried the longing for children years ago, after the first miscarriage. Now here it was, a flicker of light in the dark. She pressed a hand to her stomach, half expecting it to vanish. Mark's car was in the driveway. She found him at the kitchen table, bills spread like a crime scene. "Where've you been?" he said, not looking up. Her lips moved, but the words stuck. "I'm pregnant. We're having a child. Our son." He finally glanced at her, irritation sharpening his features. "Roof's leaking again. I told you we should have hired better contractors." The ultrasound photo burned in her purse. She imagined sliding it across the table, his face softening. Instead, she said, "I'll call someone tomorrow." He left before dawn. She sat in the nursery that wasn't, a spare room stacked with Jake's old boxes. A crib advertisement fluttered from her laptop. Dreams delivered. She traced the model's smiling face, wondering when joy became a commodity. Jake called that night. She let it ring, watching his name pulse on the shattered screen. When he texted, "Pulse. I'm in trouble," she hurled the phone into the laundry pile. The baby kicked, a phantom flutter. She dreamt of their mother, standing at the stove, stirring burnt soup, her apron stained with Jake's bloody nose. "You'll understand one day," she'd said. "Love's a debt that never closes." At 3 a.m., she dug the coffee can from the freezer. Frozen bills stuck to her fingers. For the baby, she told herself. Not him. Never him. The confrontation came on a Tuesday. Mark found the ultrasound in her drawer, tucked between unpaid bills and a half-knit sock. "What is this?" he said, voice dangerously calm. She reached for it, but he held it aloft. "Were you going to tell me, or wait until it started crying?" "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared," he laughed. "Of what? Reality?" The photo crumpled in his fist. The baby's heartbeat flatlined on paper. She packed his suitcase herself, folded his shirts neat as betrayal. When he took it, his fingers brushed hers, a ghost of the man who'd vowed to stay. The door clicked shut. The house sighed. Alone, she pressed the wrinkled ultrasound to the fridge, securing it with the magnet from their childhood cabin. Jake's face grinned from a nearby photo, frozen at 15. Her phone buzzed, another text. Answer. "I'll change." This time she replied, "Don't come back." The wind howled through the attic's rotten bones. Somewhere the roof wept. The baby arrived in a rush of blood and fluorescent light, his cries slicing through the numb fog of epidural and exhaustion. They named him Max. A solid name, Mark said, something that wouldn't bend. Emily traced the curve of his cheek, softer than anything she'd ever touched, and wondered how something so fragile could survive in a world of splintered wood and broken promises. For a while the house almost felt whole. Mark hung immobile over the crib, its stars spinning lazily in the draft from the attic. He brought takeout instead of silence, his briefcase left by the door like an apology. At night, Emily would wake to find him standing in the nursery doorway, watching Max sleep as if the child were a math problem he couldn't solve. The pain started small, a twinge in her lower back while rocking Max, a stiffness she blamed on sleepless nights. Then one morning, folding laundry, her legs buckled. The floor rushed up, cold against her cheek. Max wailed in his bassinet, fists beating the air. Mark found her there, his polished shoes stepping over the spilled detergent. "You're pushing too hard," he said, hauling her up by the elbow. His grip left bruises. Doctors spoke in hushed clusters. Words like proteinuria and glomerulonephritis buzzed past her ears. A nurse slid a consent form across the desk. Possible kidney biopsy. Emily signed without reading, her free hand jiggling Max's stroller. The coffee can in the freezer grew lighter, -200 for the sitter, 500 for the specialist, $1,000 for the MRI that lit up her abdomen like a poisoned starfield. Mark stopped leaving his briefcase by the door. The night he left, rain lashed the windows. Max's fever had spiked, his onesie soaked through. Emily rocked him in the bathroom, steam curling around her as the shower ran cold. Footsteps thudded upstairs, drawers slamming, zippers snarling. She found Mark in the attic, his suitcase swallowing sweaters she'd bought him for Christmas. The termite-riddled beam loomed overhead, its hollow core stuffed with insulation like a botched taxidermy. "Where are you going?" Her voice sounded foreign, cracked from singing lullabies. He didn't turn. Hotel. Maybe Philly. Max needs a mother who's not falling apart. The suitcase clicked shut. You think I don't see it? The pills in the diaper bag, the missed pediatrician appointments. She clutched Max tighter, his breath hitched, a wet rattle. Mark paused at the ladder, his profile sharp in the bare-bulb's glare. "I'll send money. For him." The crawl space swallowed his footsteps. The beam groaned. Alone, Emily unraveled. She forgot to eat, her milk drying up. Formula cans piled by the sink, their prices circled in red. Max's cries blended with the drip of the kitchen faucet, the creak of the buckling ceiling. One midnight, shuffling to the freezer for ice chips, she collapsed. Her vision tunneled, linoleum, dust bunnies, the cracked magnet from the cabin skittering under the fridge. Max of Wales spiraled down the hall. The paramedic's penlight seared her pupils. "Who's your emergency contact?" She gave Jake's old number. Dialysis was a vampire. 3 days a week, they strapped her to a chair, needles leaching her blood into a machine that beeped and hissed. The nurses tusked at her empty emergency forms. No family, no spouse. Max stayed with Colleen from accounting, his onesie smelling of another woman's perfume. Emily would kiss his forehead post-treatment, her lips tingling with anticoagulants, and pretend not to notice the way he flinched. The coffee can emptied. The roof caved in the east bedroom, rain nurturing mushrooms in the carpet. She hung trash bags over the gap, their rustle a perverse lullaby. The call came during a blizzard. The social worker's voice was syrup-thick. "Mr. Thompson requests visitation rights. Given your health circumstances, the court may consider revising custody." Emily hung up, her palm pressed to the fridge where the ultrasound once clung. The magnet left a ghostly square in the grime. That night, she dragged Jake's old boxes into the nursery. Baby clothes spilled out, faded dinosaurs, rocket ships. A Polaroid fluttered to the floor. Jake at 12, grinning beside the solar car he'd built, her arms slung over his shoulders. Max gummed the photo, leaving a drool stain on their mother's porch swing. "That's your uncle," she whispered. "He loved stars once." The attic beam cracked, a sound like a bone snapping. The bakery's ovens hummed through the night, their heat searing the frost on the windows. Jake kneaded dough in the glow of a single bulb, his hands raw from flour and cold. The rhythm was punishing. 4 a.m. shifts, thrice weekly deliveries, the sting of yeast in every cut. But he'd grown addicted to the ache. It proved he was alive, that he could still rise. He slept in his truck now, a sleeping bag wedged between sacks of flour. The bakery's owner, a stooped Pole named Lev, let him shower in the basement sink. "You running from cops?" Lev had asked once, eyeing Jake's knuckles. "Worse," Jake muttered. "Myself." The money came slow. He squirreled cash into a cookie tin, $5 tips, overtime pennies, the crumpled bills smelling of burnt sugar. Each deposit was a suture over the past. By March, he'd saved half what he owed her. Then Lev's daughter, Anya, appeared. Sharp-eyed and 22, she managed the books. "Your sister called," she said one dawn, holding out the bakery's landline, said it's life or death. The receiver trembled. Emily's voice, when it came, was a ghost. "Jake, Max," static swallowed the rest. He arrived at the hospital reeking of rye and regret. The IQ buzzed around Emily, a husk under sheets, her wrists tethered to tubes. A nurse eyed him wary. "You family?" "Bone marrow," he lied. The truth was worse. Tests, needles, consent forms in triplicate. The surgeon's pen hovered. Donor risks include chronic pain, infection, death. Jake scrawled his name. Death felt redundant. They prepped him in room 307, the same room where Emily had birthed Max. A stain on the ceiling mirrored the solar car from his Polaroid. You loved stars once, she told Max. Now she'd become one distant, collapsing. The anesthesia smelled like their childhood cabin, pine and decay. He woke to a scar, 7 stitches curving his flank. A nurse handed him pills. Your sister's stable, for now. He found Emily in recovery, her skin tinged pinker. Machines sang around her. When her eyes fluttered open, she recoiled. You. He deserved that. Got a job, he said. At a bakery. Her laugh rasped, making cronuts. Sordo. A pause. The heart monitor filled it. Max, she whispered. With Anya, she's good. Good undersold it. Anya had stormed into his truck at 2 a.m., Max bundled in a Star Wars onesie. You donate organs but can't change a diaper. She'd snapped, tossing him wipes. Emily's fingers grazed her abdomen, the new kidney a silent tenant. Why? He studied his hands, calloused, clean. You kept my ribs from showing when Mom forgot. She turned to the window. Snow blurred the parking lot. Recovery was a fickle god. Jake moved into Emily's rotting house, sleeping on the nursery floor. Max's cries shredded the nights. He learned bottles, rashes, the terror of a 3M fever. Anya brought formula and duct tape for the attic. You owe me, she said, patching the beam with a soup can steel. Emily returned in April, leaning on Jake's arm. The fridge still bore the ultrasound's ghost. She touched it, then the scar on his side. Does it hurt? Only when I breathe. They didn't speak of Mark. His checks arrived, postmarked from Phoenix. Jake burned them in the sink. One dawn, Emily found him at the stove, flipping pancakes charred at the edges. Max gummed a spatula in his high chair. Sunlight speared the trash bag window, glinting off the repaired mobile. You're better at this than I was, she said. He shrugged. Had a good teacher. The lie hung sweet between them. Summer baked the streets into cracked clay, the air thick with the scent of Lev's sordo and Anya's lilac perfume. Emily sat on the porch swing, salvaged from the cabin ruins, its chains oiled silent, and watched Jake teach Max to walk. The boy lurched across the lawn, fists clutching dandelions, while Jake hovered behind him like a frayed safety net. His hands, once restless with schemes, now hovered with purpose. The house wore its scars proudly. Anya's duct tape still bandaged the attic beam. The trash bag window had been replaced with stained glass from a flea market. A kaleidoscope of stars and planets that cast fractured light on the nursery floor. Emily traced her scars, smooth now, a river where pain once flowed. Inside, the coffee can sat on the counter, repurposed for cookie cutters. Max's tiny fingerprints smudged the lid. Anya emerged from the bakery van, her arms stacked with boxes. Sordo for the heathens, she announced, kicking the screen door. Her engagement ring, a simple band Jake had forged from a soup can steel, glinted in the sun. Emily had cried when he proposed, not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. He's stubborn, Anya said, nodding at Max, who now sat defiantly in the grass. Like his uncle, or his mother, Emily replied. They shared a smile, the kind forged in ER waiting rooms and 3am feedings. At dusk, Jake found Emily in the attic. She dragged up the old photo albums, their spines cracked like dried earth. He hesitated at the ladder, his shadow stretching over their mother's handwriting. Emily, 7th grade science fair. You gotta lecture me about gravity again? He joked, pointing at the solar car photo. She patted the floor beside her. Dust motes swirled in the lantern light. Remember when you tried to cook Mom's meatloaf? Burned the oven mitts. You were 10. He picked at a splinter in the floorboard. I'm sorry I wasn't there, when Max was born, when Mark left. She closed the album. You're here now. Below, Max squealed as Anya chased him with a sprinkler. The sound seeped through the floorboards, alive. The letter arrived on Tuesday. Mark's lawyerly script, demanding mediation. Emily fed it to the grill, watching the custody and parental fitness curl into ash. Jake said nothing, just handed her a skewer of marshmallows. They blazed like tiny comets. Later, she found him in the nursery, sanding the crib's rough edges. Max slept nearby, a stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. "You don't have to keep fixing things," she said. He blew sawdust from the rail. "Yeah, I do." The wedding was held in Lev's bakery. Guests sat on flour sacks. Anya wore her mother's lace apron as a veil. Jake's vows were flour-dusted and halting, but when he slipped the ring onto her finger, Lev toasted with vodka so strong it stripped paint. Emily danced with Max, his legs wobbly as a fawn's. The repaired mobile spun above them, stars glinting in time with the accordion. Fall came sharp, the first frost etching the windows. Emily stood at the stove, stirring chili as Jake wrestled Max into pajamas. Anya hummed off-key in the shower. The attic beam held. She lifted the cabin magnet from the fridge, its edges rusted, and pressed it to a new Polaroid. Jake, Anya, and Max mid-laugh, flour streaking their hair. The past and present tethered. Outside, the stars burned clear and cold. No one counted cracks anymore.